Hello and welcome to the Golfing Greenkeeper podcast. I'm Steve Smith, your host, and I've got a couple of things I think you're going to like on this one. Welcome to episode number 20. Going to get straight into it, ladies and gentlemen, for episode number 20. As you may or may not know, if you've been following me on social media, you'll know that earlier in the month of June, what am I talking about? It was towards the end of June, before Sydney's lockdown. I attended the Australian Sports Turf Managers Association, or the ASTMA as it were, their annual conference at the Gold Coast. What a fantastic event that was, and a lot of hard work went into organising the event around various different state lockdowns, least of which are mentioned to CEO of the ASTMA, Mark Unwin, and the team with him that helped put it all together. And some of the personnel, including Mark, had to quarantine to make sure the event went ahead for 2 weeks. They did a 2-week quarantine in Queensland, coming from Melbourne, and it was a fantastic event. A few hundred people from the industry were up there. Businesses that support the industry, people, superintendents, greenkeepers and the like from the industry. It was sensational and very well done to the ASTMA. Look, I just want to give you guys a bit of an update about the superstars of sports turf management that are some of the superintendents out there that have won some industry awards. And I'll start off with an award for excellence in golf course management. And that award went to Superintendent Craig Malloy of Cypress Lakes up in the Hunter Valley. I'm a huge fan of Cypress Lakes. If you do or do not know, you know now. And look, Craig's been there for about 7 years and has done a great deal of work bringing Cypress Lakes back to life. And it was recognised last month at the 2021 awards, and to Craig and his team, big congratulations. And look, if you've not been to Cyprus for quite some time, you probably don't know what you're missing out on anymore. Cyprus has been through a period in its past where it wasn't quite up to the standard that we all, used to love and remember from the early 2000s. But now, under Craig's direction as superintendent, the team that he has there, with him to bring out what he has done with the golf course. Oaks as the managers of the property, the owners of the property, Cypress Lakes. Look, Craig's been able to do a wonderful job with his team. A lot of bunker restoration and reconstruction. They're bringing in some organic gardening programs to the golf course itself. So there's a lot been going on. Trying to drought-proof it in certain different ways of water management and the like. So, look, a big deal, and certainly put Cypress Lakes on the map, and all the efforts that Craig and his team have been doing at Cypress Lakes. So that's a mention to Craig Malloy and Cypress Lakes, and also probably one of the most revered awards in the greenkeeping industry. I'm going to mention it's one that everyone in the greenkeeping industry probably holds the highest regard for, and that's the Claude Crockford Environment and Sustainability Award. That's an award that's bestowed to a superintendent who is able to maintain a golf course within its environment in the most sustainable way possible, looking after all facets of the environment. We're talking flora, fauna, water, soils, the whole kit and caboodle. And with the name of Claude Crockford at the top of it, you can probably understand where the industry is coming from, being the superintendent of Royal Melbourne for, I think, 40 years. That's the level. It's one of our awards that's held in the highest esteem, no doubt about it. And this year was awarded to Superintendent Nathan Bradbury at East Lake Golf Club in Sydney. Now, East Lake, as you probably know, is in the eastern suburbs. It's a neighbour of the lakes and the Australia and so on, and around that Sandbelt area, Bonnie Doon, that area. And look, Nathan has been there for over a decade now, has done an incredible amount of work changing the way the golf course is maintained in that environment. And it's such a sensitive, unique environment. It's akin to the likes of the Sandbelt in Melbourne. It's certainly our version in Sydney. And Nathan has built a team around him, had a vision, and has managed to execute that over a number of years to the point now where East Lake is maintained in such a magnificent way and a rewarding way for the local area. There's water table, there's water bodies around, there's lots of, there's lots of distinct remnant local vegetation in that area that's being harboured, and having to maintain a golf course within that environment and putting in these environmental practices and management plans and policies that Nathan's been able to do has obviously made waves throughout our industry. And clearly, Nathan was very deserving of this award. And if you're a member at East Lake Golf Club, you probably know what's been going on, what Nathan and his team have been up to, what the club have been up to overall. And as Nathan says it in plenty of comments that he's made since receiving the award, it's not, he takes it as an award for the club and for his team, and that he's the head of. And look, without Nathan's vision and without his direction, without the mind that he's had behind it and the goals that he wanted to kick, everyone else wouldn't have been able to do it as well. So look, Nathan's a very humble man, and he's taken that in his stride. But a big congratulations to Nathan, his team, and East Lake Golf Club for being awarded such an incredible award. And like I said, one of the highest regarded awards in our industry. So that's a big effort. And these sorts of things. And the reason I'm telling you guys in the podcast is because you guys need to know who the superstars are of sports turf in golf. Look, I think it's a big deal, and we don't promote it enough. These are the things that need to be talked about. And if you go to East Lake and if you peel back the layers and understand what they're doing and look at what's being done, you'll see the effort that they're going to do these things and what the results are, the most minimalist impacts and working and living in harmony with the local environment. That's what is going on there, and that's what Nathan's been able to do on East Lake. And to be honest, it happens at a lot of other courses as well. They're all working towards it, but Nathan has done such a great job, and it's come obviously such a long way, and now it's been recognised within the industry across Australia. So congratulations again. It's a big tick, and well done to those guys for winning those awards. And another award I wanted to mention, congratulations to Thomas Lyon from Ballarat Golf Club in Victoria, who took out the award as the winner of the ASTMA Australian Graduate of the Year. A big award for a young person to win doing their apprenticeship. And Ballarat, over the years, has been a great breeding ground for up-and-coming greenkeepers. So I don't know what's in the water down there in regional Victoria, but certainly Ballarat has been doing a great job. And congratulations to Thomas for winning that award and taking that one out. And just to mention a few of the others, the finalists, because there's one representative from each state. And so we had a couple of others, including Kurt Peters from Newcastle Golf Club in New South Wales, Adam D'Evelins from Wanneroo Golf Club in WA, Jordan Sherritt from Thaxted Park in South Australia, James Correll from Federal Golf Club in ACT, Thomas North from Royal Hobart and Tassie, and Ryan Murphy from Lakelands in Queensland. So look, lots of young up-and-coming greenkeepers that no doubt will hold, hopefully, some key positions in Australian golf clubs, and they may even venture to other parts of the world, and you hear about them in different areas doing great work on golf courses. But like I said, at Ballarat Golf Club, Superintendent Jeff Powell, he's had a few big names, up-and-coming names come out from underneath him there at Ballarat. So congratulations to Thomas Lyon from Ballarat, being the ASTMA's Graduate of the Year. And that's just a little wrap of some of the awards being won at the conference, which I think are important to note. Good to hear about new upcoming names and certainly some key golf courses that are moving forward in a positive manner in the industry that should be recognised and noted. And look, it was great to see. I caught up with a lot of people in the industry, a lot of people I've met over the years, met with some new people as well. Really good to see. Difficult that a lot of the Victorian superintendents and representatives from golf courses and the like weren't able to come because of their lockdown. So that did make it hard. We saw some really good seminars and seminars as part of the conference, which was really good. Plenty of new machinery, things that are looking at cutting edge stuff, pardon the pun, of new types of machinery that's out there and all different facets of maintenance and that sort of thing, whether it be renovations, mowing, whatever. Some good gear happening out and about that's coming in through some of the companies. And like I said, some of the seminars, I saw one on Tevan Valley, for example, the 9-hole golf course up there near Ballina in northern New South Wales. There was a talk done we had a Zoom in from Richard Forsyth from Royal Melbourne talking to us about the lead up to the President's Cup. So look, we got to see and hear about a lot of stuff that's been happening around the industry, which is fantastic. And look, these conferences are a great way. And next year is in Melbourne, so we're hoping that next year is a year that makes it easier for everyone to travel. And I think it'll be a fantastic time in Melbourne. So there you go. Thanks to everyone that was involved in the conference, and I had a great time. So thank you to the ASTMA. And it was a wonderful time. Moving on to Aussie Golf History. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a segment of the Golf and Greenkeeper podcast that I'm a huge fan of. I've only done one in the past, and it's something that I really want to bring more out in the future. It's called Aussie Golf History, and today's episode, or today's segment of Aussie Golf History, is on a bloke by the name of Ernest Banks. Alfred Ernest Dickinson Banks was his name. I'll start off with a little bit of info as a prelude to the segment. Now, I've done a lot of research for this segment, and I'll reference where I've got my information as much as I can when I'm talking, just so you know sort of the facts and where they've sort of come from. I want to thank Harley Cruz from Cruz Golf. Now, Harley, I just want to thank him for the conversations that we've had about Kamarooka, which I spoke to him about a couple of podcast episodes ago, and also, and just information from him and the work that he's done in the backgrounds of bringing out some of the history of Kamarooka as they try and work to potentially bringing Kamarooka to life. And also, off the bat, I'll say that there's some information that I wouldn't have been able to find if it wasn't for Adrian Logue's article in Golf Australia magazine. Now, Adrian Logue is doing some work on the Good Golf podcast. If you haven't listened to that already, if you have, you know who I'm talking about. And he had he'd written an article in Golf Australia magazine back in April of this year, and it was titled Finding Kamarooka. And it gives a full insight into the Kamarooka story, which in itself is extremely fascinating. And I urge you should go and read that one if you haven't already. But the article is a wonderful article about Kamarooka and the story behind it, the 9-hole golf course that it is. And Adrian was down there sort of looking at the property and the lay of the land with Harley. And the article's about the history of the place. Now, Ernest Banks was a professional golfer from England. Specifically, he was a professional at a club by the name of Dover Golf Club in the county of Kent in England. For around 11 years, from what I can find out, is how long he was a professional there. Now, the golf course at Dover Golf Club was a 9-hole course that these days sadly no longer exists. And to be honest, not a great deal is known about Ernest and his English heritage predating what I can discover of his time being the pro at Dover Golf Club. But I have discovered that apart from being a professional golfer, he was also quite competent at golf course maintenance, as it turns out. Dover Golf Club itself began life in 1890 at a location called North Fall Meadow in Dover, which was just to the northwest of a place called Dover Castle, which in itself is pretty impressive. Now, for those of you like me that don't know much at all about the UK, Dover Castle is at the southern end of what I've heard of, and I'm sure you have all heard of, are the White Cliffs of Dover. Beautiful tourist destination, wonderful landscape there. And as I was doing all this research, I was finding all this stuff out. But I have heard of the White Cliffs of Dover. So that's where we are. That's where we're talking about at the moment. Dover Golf Club moved from that location to a new location to the northeast side of Dover Castle, which opened in the new course on the 21st of November 1904. And this course had glimpses of the sea from various points around it. So they were talking about it being quite a lovely location. And basically, it's really right near the cliffs itself with this new location. Now, from what I also read about the 9-hole course located here, it sort of sounds to have been something quite interesting indeed. And for us in modern Australia, with no significant colonial history, having a golf course next to a castle, I'm sure would have been quite something special. There's no doubt about that. The bunkers of the new course were apparently natural, and some were partly artificially made. The fortifications around the castle were actually utilised in 2 instances on the golf course itself. Now, some holes I'll mention because they'll be of reference to Banks's story a little bit later on. Now, the first hole, and this is all the stuff that I'm finding out about the long-lost course of Dover, which I'm going to call it. The first hole appears to have been a short bogey 5, where the second shot is played along the angle of a dummy fort that was built around the castle, the ditch of which guards the green of the first hole. The second hole, the tee shot required the player to hit over the bank and the ditch of the fort, making their way to the second green. The third was a 250-yard hole whose only bunkers were bits of rough grass, which effectively were there to catch a topped drive, as they termed it, and stop a running up approach to the green. The fourth is a cleek shot, as they wrote it, into an old chalk pit. So I'm picturing, a bit more of like a punch bowl style green, playing down to the green sort of thing, something along those lines. Moving forward to the eighth. The eighth hole was where a tee shot is guarded by rough ground and a ditch, another ditch. These are all part of these lay of the land that they utilised around the castle. Now, while a bunker forms the hazard for the second shot on your way to the 8th green. Now, this is just a quick snapshot as to the course that Ernest was working at, and it gives us an idea of the type of golf course design he knew of. Now, I mentioned that Ernest was competent at course maintenance, and it was in October 1908 that a bloke by the name of Tom Varden, yes, Harry Varden's brother, played at Dover Golf Club in a foursomes event. Now, Tom Varden may have been the lesser-known brother. However, he could certainly play golf almost just as good as brother Harry. Tom played in no less than 19 Open Championships between 1892 and 1909, just to give you an idea. And he had 9 top 10 finishes, including second to Harry at Prestwick in 1903. He tied third at Hoylake in 07 and fourth at Royal St George's in 1904. Now, I mentioned Royal St George's in there, and that was part of his highest rankings. That's where they're playing the Open Championship just this week, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to seeing. So, referencing timeframes, guys, that's 115 years ago, more or less, and we're still playing Royal St George's, which is really, really interesting, and I'm certainly looking forward to it. Now, after Tom had played at Dover in 1908, it was reported in the Dover Express as follows, and I quote, "His opinion of the course does great credit to Banks, the local professional. He pronounced the grass in capital order and the course a sporting one for a 9-hole course. He was very pleased in every way with the manner in which it is kept." Now, that's big words from a well-experienced touring professional, I must say. And, I'm sure that's quite telling as well when you've got a 9-hole course and you're getting those sorts of comments that are pretty good, a great advertisement for a local golf course to have a guy of the calibre of Tom saying those sorts of things. Now, between 1909 and 1914, Ernest Banks played in a number of publicised professional golf events, so he was clearly throwing his hand at this point in time at the touring professional circuit. He was wanting to test himself against the best and wanted to earn a living, also making some more money. Now, on the 4th of June in 1909, he was reported in the starting list of a qualifying event for the Open Championship that was being held at Deal the following week. In July 1910, another example, he was reported as competing at a professional event for a prize purse of £240. There's a few bucks thrown around just quietly. In 1911, he was reported in the starting list of the qualifying event for the Open Championship again, this one being held at Royal St George's. There you go. So they played one that Tom Varden was in, that I mentioned, 1911, Royal St George's pops up again. So, look, if you haven't heard of Royal St George's, this is how long ago they were playing it. And it's still a stalwart of the circuit. Now, Banks was reported the following week to have scored quite poorly at the Royal St George's event. So I'd say that he never qualified for that Open Championship. In September 1912, he was reported in the starting list for a qualifying event for a tournament, which with a prize purse of £400. £400 in 1912. I've done some rough calculations because I looked at that and I was like, holy hell, that's a lot of cash for back then. Calculations in today's Australian money, it works out to be around $87,000 for a local tournament. That's some pretty good coin. I reckon there was a few people flocking to try and, a few professionals flocking to try and play that one. We move along a little bit. So that just gives you an idea of where Ernest was and the events that he was playing. So he was really getting his name out there and competing. And he was, basically saying that I can play golf. Here I am. I want to show off whether I'm any good and try and earn some more bucks. On the 19th of June 1914, Ernest would marry his wife, Lily O'Kelly, in London. They would then go away for their honeymoon, which must have been short because on the 9th of November 1914, we find and discover that Ernest and Lily would arrive in Sydney. Now, let me fill in that blank if we can for you. They arrived in Sydney aboard the SS Ceramic. Now, the Ceramic was a steam ocean liner and was built to do the run between Liverpool in England and Sydney, Australia. The trip that Ernest and Lily were on, incidentally, was the last run for the Ceramic before it was requisitioned for the 1st Australian Imperial Force as a troop ship for World War I. So they basically caught the last boat out of Liverpool to get to Sydney. And this is where some interesting stuff goes on. And as I was rediscovering and reading up, I'm young enough to not know about the war, not apart from, family history and that sort of stuff. So I wasn't around, I wasn't that close to it. So I didn't really know the dates off the top of my head. And reading this was quite interesting. It was all pretty hasty from when Ernest got married to Lily in June 1914. They had a honeymoon and they left to come to Australia. Well, World War I kicked right off in July 1914, as you probably know the dates. And as it turned out, Ernest was sent to Australia by a bloke named Sir Robert Lucas Tooth, who was an Australian businessman. Now, Banks was sent here to construct a golf course that was to be built at his Kamarooka estate in southern New South Wales. So now you're starting to see where we're joining dots here. There's somewhat of a sidetrack here where Lucas Tooth interjects heavily into Banks' story. Now you see, Ernest was 38 in 1914, and having just got married, I can only assume that he was probably pretty lucky to leave the UK on the cusp of the outbreak of World War I. And maybe there was something in the planning between Banks and Lucas Tooth, or maybe the timing was just pure luck. I'm not sure we'll ever know that one, but regardless of, Ernest turns up in Sydney. Now, I don't know how or when Lucas Tooth found Banks and coaxed him to travel to Australia to build him a golf course. That's a pretty tall order. Can you imagine that conversation? Not that we know of the connection. I can't find any connection. But it's been well documented that Banks arrived under Lucas Tooth's direction and was sent here to do a job. What I do know is that going back up the Tooth family tree, the Tooth family was from Cranbrook in Kent. So I guess that means they were somewhat from the local area, albeit in today's time it's about an hour's drive from Cranbrook to Dover. But the Tooth family were from that side of Kent. So maybe, I'm not sure there was a connection. That's how they found each other. That said, Lucas Tooth himself was living at the time in his family home called Holme Lacey near Hereford, which is basically on the other side of England. So look, we've been searching. I've been doing a lot of searching, spoken to Harley. Harley's talked a lot to Adrian. They've done lots of research, and I can't find the direct connection. But like I said, it's been documented here in Australia that Lucas Tooth had sent Banks over. So we still really speculate as to how they met. Now, that aside, there's also a legend or a myth, as it were, in Australia that the golf course Sir Robert Lucas Tooth wanted to build at Kamarooka was designed by Laurie Octoloni. Now, he was a Scotsman, a famous golf professional of St Andrews and of the notable Scottish Octoloni golf family. And Lucas Tooth had possibly, the story goes, the myth goes, had possibly sent Banks out to Australia to build Octoloni's design. Now, there's so far never been any tangible evidence that Octoloni actually designed Kamarooka. That said, I myself can't find anything to disprove the myth either. And to be fair, if anyone could get a name like Octoloni, my guess is a man like Sir Robert Lucas Tooth could have been that man to do so. I suppose, all in all, that legend of Octoloni will remain lurking in the background of the Kamarooka story, but that's where I'll leave that one alone, because I can't find anything, but, like I said, I can't find anything to say otherwise either. So all we actually know for a fact is that it was documented that Sir Robert Lucas Tooth sent Banks out to Australia to build a 9-hole golf course at Kamarooka. This course was mainly to be for the farmers and their families at Kamarooka, but would also be open to the public as a local attraction. And also Banks's job was to establish the game of golf at Kamarooka. Now, Kamarooka is about 20 minutes drive west up the valley from Bega. So we're in southern New South Wales. Down on the coast, you go up the valley, 20 minutes inland or thereabouts from Bega, and you come to Kamarooka. Pause. I've gone a bit quick through lots of locations at the moment and lots of names. So like I've said, I hope you can keep up with me as well. And you might be thinking right now, what is Kamarooka? If you haven't heard the story, you haven't read the article, what's Kamarooka? I've never heard of it, you might be saying. And you probably, if you're super fast, you've already opened up your Maps app and you're searching for Kamarooka just to see where it is. It is on a map. It's still there. Well, the best modern day comparison I can give you as to what Kamarooka was and why it was such an important place, the best modern day comparison I can give you is a place called Elliston, which is located in the Upper Hunter Valley, west of Newcastle, in New South Wales. It's north of Sydney. Yes, the famous large, sprawling pastoral cattle and horse property formerly owned by the late media magnate Kerry Packer. That is Elliston. Oh, and there's apparently a pretty good golf course there too, Harley tells me. Apparently not a bad little track up there. So like a modern-day Elliston, Kamarooka was a large pastoral holding. Kamarooka already had plenty of history by the time Sir Robert Lucas Tooth had purchased the property from his uncle back in 1864. That's the age we're talking. We're talking back in the 1800s that Kamarooka was there. And it was there even before that with the Imlay brothers and so on. There's a rabbit hole you can go down for sure in that one, people. Now, Lucas Tooth wanted to introduce his own ideas. So he's bought the property from his uncle and he wanted to bring his own ideas into building Kamarooka up. So he modelled the estate on the English style of working pastoral properties that he knew from back in England. And, you know, this is whereby you created a village, a central area for the families and the workers of the property, things like a church, general store, school, community hall, post office, gardens, an ornamental lake for recreation. He was building basically a small town that was part of his property. And it lent itself to, you know, people feeling a lot better, having a nice community. It wasn't just a place for work. The Kamarooka property was a large cattle farm among other types of farming, and under Sir Robert would become a large dairy farm also, ultimately being famous for cheese, named Kamarooka cheese no less. Now Kamarooka basically kick-started what would eventually become the famous cheese region of New South Wales, being that of the Bega Valley. This is all from, so if you know the Bega Valley, you know Bega cheese, you know all the cheese places down there. They all stem from what Lucas Tooth had done at Kamarooka, and then that region sort of just boomed from there because it was such a big cheese manufacturing or cheese making region. So Lucas Tooth himself would also become a politician in New South Wales. This is the size of this bloke, right? I'll give you a little bit of his background to give you a feel for why Kamarooka was so big and why he could do what he wanted to. So he became a politician in New South Wales and held the seat of Monero. And after moving to England, so he moved over to England from here, would stand for politics over there as well. Robert Lucas Tooth would also become a partner of the giant Tooth & Co., which was a family business from his father and uncles and so on. So there was a lot of family lineage in that. Now, being a partner of the giant Tooth & Co., it had many large-scale business ventures in it, and it had a brewing company named Kent Brewery, which was started by Lucas Tooth's great uncle in Parramatta, now which is probably Sydney's largest western suburb, which some of you may know as producing the likes of KB Lager, which for me, being a younger person, I didn't know what KB was a long time ago. But it was made more famous in modern times by a bloke with the name of Reg Reagan from the NRL footy show, which you might know of. Now, Tooth & Co. also later bought Resch's, so they owned the Resch's brand and produced a number of other beer labels over the years. So they were a big beer manufacturing, a big brewery. Tooth & Co. historically was one of Australia's oldest companies and was in business for nearly 150 years. That's how big this thing was. That's how big this company was. This you might call it a conglomerate now. Incidentally, Tooth & Co.'s logo was a white rearing horse, which is the symbol for the county of Kent. And you'll probably remember seeing the logo on the beer, for any of you people that have drunk the beer. It was a white rearing horse, a symbol for the county of Kent, hence the name Kent Brewery and the logo. It was a throwback to their heritage of Kent. On the beer spectrum, Tooth & Co. also produced people like Chuck Hahn, who worked in the Kent Brewery and also the Waverley Resch's Brewery, and would obviously go on to start his own boutique brewing house in, as we now know it, Hahn Beer. So look, that's just some of the stuff that's come out of Tooth & Co., just to give you an idea of their beer side of life, which I'm sure many people know about. So Sir Robert Lucas Tooth was extremely wealthy and had huge vision for anything he touched. And they were in all sorts of other different, he was on the board of CSR, in mining, and they had so much going on. So that's how big they were. Now back to Ernest Banks. So Ernest was here to build a golf course for Sir Robert at Kamarooka, and in a strange and unusual kind of way, Banks arrived in Sydney and went straight, more or less, to Kamarooka, passing by any sightseeing opportunities from a golf perspective in Australia. This means that, and you've heard me chatting to Harley Cruz about this, like I said, a couple of podcasts ago, that a unique design style of Kamarooka is the penal school of design, or the penal style of golf course design. And Banks brought that with him from the UK. Now, remember when I was describing the course at Dover Golf Club where he was working before he left? That's some of those things, and ditches and long grass banks and mounds. And now, because of that, because he skipped everything in Australia going to Kamarooka, he wasn't influenced by any of the other styles that were emerging in Australia at that time, with the likes of people Dan Suter, Carnegie Clark, Jazz Scott, who were somewhat, for this time in Australian golf, prolifically laying out courses throughout New South Wales, with the likes of some in Sydney, the Blue Mountains, the Southern Highlands. All these, more or less, Banks would have sort of had an opportunity to go to, but he was going straight to work. That's what he was here for. He was here for Kamarooka. So work was first. Ernest, in doing so, was basically transplanting his UK experience straight onto the land in Australia. No local research, no local understanding, just his experience and expertise that Sir Robert had entrusted in him. So Ernest arrives here and gets on with the job of building a course at Kamarooka, like I said. Now, there's a bit of fanfare about Banks's arrival to build this course, and it was a big deal to indeed build a course anywhere because it was at great expense to do so. Now, there was an article written in the Southern Record and Advertiser on the 21st of November 1914 that Banks had arrived with his wife the week before and was there to build them a golf course at the request of Sir Robert Lucas Tooth and establish golf at the estate. Now, a golf course was more so then than now definitely something very special indeed to have. After all, it wasn't like building a cricket oval or a footy field. These were established sports in Australia. They were well rooted already in Australia. Golf was still very much an emerging sport in Australia, although it was starting to kick into gear, by the 1920s. Banks was reported to have mentioned a rough time frame for having the course completed, and that was in 8 months. But he was hesitant to be held to that time frame, as he was uncertain how the grass types that he wanted to use would thrive in the local soil. Like I said, no research stuff being done here. He just got into it. Now, the site had been declared for the golf course, which was to be 9 holes on the banks of the Vicandelo Creek near the main crossroads at Kamarooka. He was reported as saying, Banks was reported as saying that he considered the natural advantages of the locality admirable and anticipates that it will be amongst the best and most up-to-date golfing ground in the state. Now, I'm sure that was as much confidence and salesmanship as anything else, as I don't believe, like I said before, he had time to consider any other golf course examples around. So in terms of comparing it to other places in New South Wales, he never had a chance to see them. So he was just stating that with his confidence, he was going to build the best. That was him. Now, as mentioned by Adrian Logue from his article in Finding Kamarooka, the manager of the property had written a report for the week ending the 14th of August 1915. So we're jumping through here. There's no notes or anything that anyone has come across about the golf course during construction. So we jump to 14th of August 1915, where the manager's report says golf course finished. And there's some notes about the final detailing work being done in preparation of the course and rolling greens and top dressing the greens and so on. Now, in my opinion, I do think that Banks would have been the one behind the design, based on the words written in articles and so on, without any references to a connection with Octoloni. That's my opinion through my research. That's what I think. I think it was Banks. I don't know that there was any connection otherwise. That's me. And if my calculations are correct, that time frame puts the construction completion to a 9-month build from when Banks arrived back in November 1914 to when the manager's notes on the 14th of August 1915 say that the golf course was finished. Now, that's not a bad estimate from a guy that turned up stone cold, knowing little about the Australian landscape and environment. I'm telling you, that's damn impressive. Kamarooka Golf Course was to also become an attraction of the area, like I'd mentioned earlier, and had been written about in a number of articles in prominent Sydney newspapers. Now, for example, I talked about what was being built at Kamarooka. There was a residential hostel built next to the golf course, which was described by one reporter as a palatial clubhouse. Now, that article was from the Sun newspaper of Sydney, dated the 11th of March 1917, which showed an illustration of the clubhouse, along with a quote stating that it ranks with the best in Australia. And I've got to tell you, the image of this for back then in 1978 was just spectacular. It's a fantastic looking building. And sadly, the building no longer exists. I think it was a fire that happened and the building's gone. Now, again, huge raps of Kamarooka from a golf point of view that's coming out in the Sydney papers. Now, it should be noted that sadly, this is post the opening of the golf course and rave reviews and everything. I'll jump back a little bit. Sadly, on the 19th of February in 1915, so what's that, a few months before Kamarooka was completed, Sir Robert Lucas Tooth passed away at his home in Holme Lacey, back in England, of a brain hemorrhage, and never got to see the finished course that Banks had built at Kamarooka for him. Pretty sad, really, when you have someone of that stature in Lucas Tooth. And he was doing regular trips every year, backwards and forwards to Australia. He had lots of business interests here. It was one of his homes. It was basically, he was born in Sydney, moved to back to England, but Kamarooka held a very, very special place in his heart. And he never got to see the golf course. That's pretty sad, and I can't imagine that news breaking through the estate at Kamarooka would have been pretty devastating. But nevertheless, they finished the course. Banks finished the course, and it opened to much fanfare. Now, a rough guide to the course that Banks built is as follows. And remember, if you were hitting a ball 180 yards off a tee, you were considered long. And I'm talking John Daly long. I'm talking Dustin Johnson long. And look, throw Bryson long if you want to, but, he's not too bad. He gets beaten by plenty. These comments were from commentators that reported about the course in a couple of newspaper articles over the following years after the course's completion. And also remember that courses were not rated to par but to bogey, right? So I'll describe them. It's more or less bogey what it is, one more than you might think for par in a modern day. So the first hole was around 310 yards. It was a bogey 5. And it had a long carry from the tee over the Candelo Creek down to the fairway. The fairway had bunkers left and right, and the green itself was considered to be heavily protected around it by bunkers for the errant player, as they put it. Now, that, my friends, is the loosener. That's the opening hole. That's the one that's meant to ease you into the game, if you like. A long carry over a creek, bunkers left and right, bunkers around the green. Sure, Ernest, no worries. Thanks for that. The second hole was a shortish 220-yard bogey 4 hole. Probably the loosener you really needed at 1, to be honest. The third hole was a 360-yard bogey 5 dogleg with a gully running across the line of approach to the undulating green. Now, this is where you start to hear some of the similarities to what I mentioned about in Dover. You know, a gully on approach to the green running at an angle, like the ditches and things that were used around the castle at Dover and the Dover golf course. The fourth hole was around 290 yards long, but was uphill all the way and ran through a corridor of trees. The fifth was another longish bogey 5 at 360 yards and had a long enough carry again off the tee, so much so that it could have been considered fairly stiff to manage by some. Now, there was a steep slope on the left side of the hole, so if you were to pull it off the tee for a right-handed player, you'd run down the slope, making it difficult to hit the green for 2. We moved to the 6th, which was a downhill 420-yard bogey 5 with no less than 12 bunkers on the hole. This is 1915, guys. 12 bunkers on a hole. And this wasn't a sandy landscape. This wasn't a coastal golf course. It wasn't easy to do. These are manufactured bunkers, artificial as they put them back then. A lot of work went into this stuff. The 7th was a short 110-yard bogey 3, completely surrounded with bunkers. The 8th was a long bending 460-yard bogey 5 hole with another long carry from the tee to the fairway. Long grass guards and bunkers on either side of the fairway, and a green well guarded again by bunkers. This would have been a challenging golf course at best. And the finishing 9th hole was a 260-yard bogey 4 with what they termed a green of the basin variety. Now, I'm thinking back to that chalk pit hole that they had on the Dover golf course. So something down to what we would now term a punch bowl green, basically. So he's obviously using the style of golf course design that he knew, that he was playing, that he was maintaining, that he was part of back in Dover, back in England, and competing on. That's what he was thinking when he brought it here. And that's a lap of what Ernest Banks built at Kamarooka, and what we know is his first and, as far as we know, only design from scratch in Australia. Now, a little footnote to the Kamarooka part of this story, and to put timing into perspective. Taronga Zoo in Sydney didn't open until 1916. Kamarooka was already open. Qantas wasn't around. They hadn't even formed until 1920. Kamarooka was built. Commonwealth Golf Club hadn't opened yet for play, and that wasn't until 1921. Kingston Heath didn't open for play until 1925. New South Wales Golf Club in Sydney's eastern suburbs, as we know, didn't open for play until 1928. But Sir Robert Lucas Tooth sent Ernest Banks to his estate in southern New South Wales, somewhere in the middle of nowhere between Sydney and Melbourne, to build a 9-hole golf course, because that's what he felt it needed and that's what he wanted to build there for the people. All done before a lot of these other things were happening. So that's how long ago we're talking, putting it into perspective. Before some of our most famous courses were open for play. Banks had already built Kamarooka. Now today, Kamarooka no longer exists, which is again detailed in Adrian Logue's article. The course ceased in around the early 2000s and is now just a grown-over grazed paddock at the Kamarooka property. Sad in a sense. You know, and there's a story to it. Like I said, go and read this article, Finding Kamarooka by Adrian. You'll really enjoy it. If you're looking to get a bit of an insight into a bit of Australian golf course history, Kamarooka is a great story. So that first stanza of Ernest Banks' story at Kamarooka is finished, but we're not yet finished with Ernie. No sirree, Bob. After Kamarooka's construction was completed, he and his wife moved to Sydney, where in 1916 it was reported that he was in charge of the club and course of Bonnie Doon Golf Club in Sydney at its previous location in Arncliffe on the banks of the Cook River. Not where Bonnie Doon is today, but its location prior to that. Now, my guess, with the year missing from the end of Kamarooka being built in 1915 and being at Bonnie Doon in 1916, is that he probably stayed for a time growing in and managing the course at Kamarooka before leaving. So whilst the manager's notes say that the course was finished construction, I'm going to say, knowing what he was doing at Dover, maintaining the golf course, raps from Tom Varden, that sort of stuff, I'm going to say that he grew it in. That he didn't just build it and leave, I'm going to say that he grew it in. So I reckon he spent some time there before coming to being posted at Bonnie Doon. That's my guess. Little is known about his time at Bonnie Doon, other than the announcement in a newspaper article that had stated he worked there in that role in 1916. That's when that article was. That's all I can find. And there's probably good reason. This was right in wartime. Bonnie Doon Golf Club's own history, their own timeline of their history, has a blank period from 1916 to 1919. And that's when it points towards Banks being at Bonnie Doon. So it's hard to find much other than that newspaper report. But in 1919, there's another newspaper report of a 250-yard extension to the 13th hole at Bonnie Doon that was open for play in January of 1919. And in October 1920, another report mentions that a bloke named Victor James, this is in Bonnie Doon's history, that Victor James was employed by Bonnie Doon as its first golf professional. Now, after reading all this, my thought is, with Banks's experience building Kamarooka and being in charge of a club and course at Bonnie Doon, not the professional, because remember, it's wartime, like I said, a club may not have needed a golf professional. They just needed someone to manage the place, maybe. And my guess is that he was behind the works of the 13th hole extension at Bonnie Doon. And also during that time was actually looking after the course like he'd done back in Dover. And what I think, no doubt, was doing at Kamarooka, like I said, after the completion of the course construction there. So I reckon for the 3 years that I can't find any information about Banks, we don't hear about anything, Bonnie Doon has a blank in that time period, I reckon that Banks was there looking after the place. Not as a professional, but looking after the course and looking after the club. Now, the war was officially over in November 1918, and the 13th extension opened in January 1919. It's only a few months. And it wasn't long before Ernest and wife Lily were again on the move, I suppose still trying to find their place in Australia. On the 2nd of May 1919, in the Arrow newspaper in Sydney, it was reported that Ernest Banks had been appointed secretary and professional of the Wentworth Falls Golf Club. Now, if you've listened to this podcast, you'll know that is my home golf course I grew up on. And that's also where I'd previously done a story about Dan Suter. The first original 9 holes was designed by Dan Suter in 1913 and opened for play in 1915. So it's just 4 years after Wentworth Falls was opened that Banks is employed to manage a joint. Now, from Dover to Kamarooka to Wentworth Falls, he's probably by now wondering how the hell he ended up back in English weather up in the Blue Mountains. I'm sure he is, because it'd be a far cry from what you'd think you'd be coming to in Australia. Now, Banks was the second person managing the course and working in the pro shop, as I've found out in the history book of Wentworth Falls. But my research suggests that he was the first actual golf professional employed at the club. Now that he found a home at Wentworth Falls Golf Club and golf tournaments were starting up again, Ernest would get out and try to earn some more money competing in some tournaments again, like he'd done back in Dover. On the 25th of July 1919, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that the Australian Golf Club was holding their Australian medal competition on the 26th, which was a 36-hole handicap event, and it had 16 professionals in the field. The 28th of July was the qualifying round of the Professional Golfing Championship, not to be confused with the Australasian Open or the Australian Open. It was the Professional Golfing Championship, which again Banks was competing in against all other professionals, and I can imagine that the round on the weekend just days earlier was probably a practice round for the event. There was still no Australian Open at this time, and there were grumblings in the media about this Professional Golfing Championship, as it was a different format, and some of the golf media didn't like it from what I've read. They didn't like the idea at all. They just wanted to either have the Australian Open or nothing. None of this thing in between. Now, the Monday event was played in what was described in the media as hurricane conditions, and Banks had played terribly so. There was some ridiculously high scores in that field that I saw, and Banks was one of them. He didn't play well at all. Now, there'd been some reports that Banks was representing Lura at this time, but these were incorrect. As I've worked out, as Charlie Campbell was a resident pro from Lura and Banks was from Wentworth Falls Golf Club. They were just some typos that they got wrong, and Banks was at Wentworth Falls at that time. Now, they competed against each other, Banks and Campbell, on plenty of occasions. Back to Banks's skills as a keeper of the greens, on the 31st of December 1919, it was reported in the referee paper in Sydney, and I quote, "E. Banks has made great improvements during the time he has been retained by the club," that being Wentworth Falls, "the most noticeable being the raising of the 2nd and 9th greens. He has got the fairways and greens into first-class condition. Nobody better could have been retained by the club, as he has had very big experience in this work. He was specially selected and brought out by Sir Robert Lucas Tooth to lay out the course at Kamarooka. He also had 11 years with the Dover Club in England." End quote. Now, there's more about Banks in the Arrow in Sydney on the 2nd of Jan 1920. And I quote again, "E. Banks, who has had very large experience in the best methods of course architecture and greenkeeping, has been attached to the club for some time, during which he has made very marked improvements. The 2nd green has been built up, which it badly needed." Wentworth Falls Golf Club was clearly a very popular golf course and was well regarded, and they were able to get some big names regularly to play in different events at Wentworth Falls. Now, I was researching this story, and like I said, I know Wentworth Falls. I grew up there, and I backwards worked there. And I was fascinated to read some of the names attached. Not only players, but businesses and business people and all sorts of stuff. It's quite interesting. Now, on the 5th of February 1920, an article was written in the evening newspaper of Sydney stating, "An interesting 4-ball match has been arranged for Saturday, April 10, between T.E. Howard and E. Banks versus E. Appley and C. Campbell for a trophy." So a side point is that, and we've probably heard of Eric Appley and Tom Howard. Now, they were noted as being the 2 leading amateurs of New South Wales, and Banks and Campbell among the leading professionals. So there's a pretty high-profile little match going on. 1920 was a big year for Banks in both playing events and also his greenkeeping and architecture skills being noted. Like I mentioned, the 2nd of April 1920 reported that grass tees will be in use. The 2nd green at Wentworth Falls has been raised and the 6th green vastly improved. On the 8th of May 1920, Wentworth Falls Professional Stroke Comp was held and invited many pros from all over, especially Sydney. Banks competed, but he didn't win that one. But after the event is an interesting one, and I didn't know they did this sort of stuff back then. After the event, there was a driving competition that took place, and Banks won that. So even 100 years ago, they were having driving comps. They might have been hitting at 200 yards to win, but they were having driving comps nonetheless. That shows you how long that level of simple competition has been around, who can hit it the furthest. Then the big one makes a return. The big tournament in Australia. The first Australian Open since the start of World War I was on again and was to be held at the Australian Golf Club at Kensington in Sydney. So the previous one was 1913. That was the last Australian Open at the time. And then they had a gap for World War I, and it was back in 1920. Ernest was listed in the starting field and played in the tournament. He scored terribly. It's like every time he got to the big stage, he did struggle a bit. I can only assume by the scores that I've seen and where he sits in the lists. He scored terribly so in the tournament, finishing dead last in the field of professionals. Now remember, there were mostly amateurs competing back then, and only a good handful, I think there's about 15 or so, professionals competing. Reports suggested E. Banks had a great deal of bad luck. No doubt, clearly, because he finished stone motherless last. Fast forward 4 months, and Ernest Banks and Lily are shown on the list of passengers aboard the SS Marinda, bound for Rabaul on the island of New Britain in Papua New Guinea. All of a sudden, I've come across this article and I'm like, what's going on? What happened? I've gone from playing tournaments, being a pro, doing works at Wentworth Falls, and next thing they're on a boat and they're bound for PNG, for Rabaul. What? Now, an article was written in the Blue Mountains Echo on the 24th of December 1920, and it was just after he'd left, as it turns out. The article is as follows. Mr. and Mrs. Banks of the Wentworth Falls Golf Clubhouse have gone to Rabaul to manage a hotel there. They will be much missed at the clubhouse, where their courteous treatment of everyone gained them the esteem of the members who wish them every success in their new home. So clearly both Ernest and Lily made an impact at Wentworth Falls, and I dare say anywhere they were living and working they made an impact. They sounded like some pretty good, genuine people, but Banks was a hard worker as well by the sounds. So after boarding the SS Marinda on the 23rd of November 1920, that's the last we hear of Ernest Banks in Australian golf. That's it. No more. He's left the country. Come in 1914, left 1920. A 6-year whirlwind tour, Kamarooka, Bonnie Doon, Wentworth Falls, competing in the Australian Open, competing in different events. I mean, what a whirlwind. But he left a bit of a mark. Now, the Banks story has just a couple of final pieces, however. Upon researching anything to do with golf and Rabaul and PNG, I was coming up totally empty-handed until I come across an article in the Pacific Islands Monthly. Who knew? The Pacific Islands Monthly on the 17th of March 1931. And there was a headline. Don't ask me even why I read the article, but I was just trying to get hold of anything remotely related to golf, because here I'm thinking, this bloke who's just known golf most of his life has left to become to find a new venture, to find new life in PNG, and I was just like, what's going on? The article is as follows, and I summarise it. The 11th of January, and it's the year 1931. The new golf course at Lukanai, let's go with Lukanai, was formally opened. It was laid out around the Lukanai racecourse, and it is largely due to the energy and enthusiasm of E. Banks that such excellent results have been obtained. Now, there's a little bit more to the article, noting some dignitaries that were there during the opening presentation, local grass types that were used that were difficult to grow into the fairways, etc. But my thinking is that this would have to be our Ernest Banks. That's what I'm thinking. That Lukanai was near Rabaul, and they were building a golf course. It's, 11 years after he left Australia. And incidentally, they went there to look after a hotel, to manage and own a hotel, as we find out. But 11 years afterwards, so I come across it, I'm going to say it's the same Ernest Banks who's built a golf course. Interesting. So anyway, he moved to Rabaul. They moved to Rabaul to own and manage a hotel, but clearly he still had golf niggling away in the background. Now, Harley, Cruz and I speculate in discussions that Ernest possibly just wasn't able to make a living playing golf. He may have been fed up with the cold weather of the Blue Mountains and possibly finding it hard to manage golf courses in the drier climate of Australia compared to that of his native England. So, look, who knows? Who knows? He and Lily may have been wanting a tropical, warm new life, and in Rabaul they'd found that opportunity. We don't know, but that's what's happened. That's where they went. 1920 leave, end up at Rabaul, and then in 1931 we find that the E. Banks is attached to a golf course being built at Lucanai. So anyway, there you go. And again, I dare say we may never actually find out the reasons. So there was an itch that Ernest had to scratch once again, and this time it was in Lucanai in Papua New Guinea. The final stanza, the final part, we jump now to December 1942 when everything then changed dramatically. And you might know why. World War II was underway, and the Pacific Islands and countries were right in the middle of it all. I'm far from a person with experience in wartime history, but I'll do my best here, so let's see how we go. Sometime in December 1941, it's reported that most civilian men were forced to stay in Rabaul and defend the port of Rabaul, and women and children were evacuated from the island of New Britain, which PNG, Papua New Guinea, was being defended by Australian troops. The Japanese were about to start a raid on Rabaul to capture it, as it was considered a strategic location for their advancements. It was a deep-sea port for their Navy ships and had an airfield at Lucanai. On the 4th of January 1942, the Battle of Rabaul began, and over a number of weeks the Japanese would overrun the Allied forces and take control of Rabaul. 7 months later, on the 1st of July 1942, Ernest's name pops up again. This time he's a POW. Aboard the Japanese transport ship Montevideo Maru, which was bound for Hainan Island. I'm struggling with some of these. I don't know these locations. I'm trying to pronounce them to the best of my ability. Hainan Island is where it was heading. The ship was 65 miles west of Cape Bojador, Luzon, which is the very northwest tip of the Philippines. If you know that region, had to Google map that one. Had no idea. So unbeknownst to a closing submarine, the USS Sturgeon, this Japanese vessel was transporting Allied POWs. The USS Sturgeon had located the Japanese vessel, and a Japanese vessel at that time was the enemy. They'd fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 2 torpedo hits are scored on the starboard side, and the ship sank at 3:37 a.m. by the stern. All 1,050 POWs, 9 crew and 11 guards died aboard the ship. About 80 crew escaped aboard lifeboats and made their way to a nearby Japanese outpost. I haven't been able to find any information as to what happened to Ernest's wife Lily, but the reports were that women and children were evacuated from Rabaul, but I can't find anything else. And as far as I know, they didn't have any children either. Alfred Ernest Dickinson Banks was 66 years old when he died aboard the Montevideo Maru, which was sunk by Allied forces in the South China Sea. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Ernest Banks. A man who carved a life in golf starting in Dover, England, took an opportunity of a lifetime and possibly a lifeline with his new wife at the onset of World War I to come to Australia on assignment from a very influential personality in this country, being that of Sir Robert Lucas Tooth. Ernest Banks, somewhat under the radar, in my opinion, left a mark on golf history in New South Wales, and for me it was very interesting that some of his journey shaped the history of my home course at Wentworth Falls Country Club as it's known today. A golf professional, greenkeeper, club manager, golf course architect, golf course builder, hotel owner and husband. That, ladies and gentlemen, listeners alike, that was Alfred Ernest Dickinson Banks. I hope you enjoyed listening to that story, albeit with somewhat of a sad end to Ernest's life, and we don't know what happened to Lily. But quite a fascinating story from a land far away in England for us here in Australia, but certainly there's an attachment. An interesting connection with Lucas Tooth. interesting stories in golf courses and construction. I really had an incredible time researching it all and putting all that together. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope you got a bit of fascination out of it. And please dive into any of those things. Lucas Tooth, Kamaruka, there's plenty of stories there that are worthy of just a bit of Googling to just see a little bit more about them yourselves. Thanks for listening to Aussie Golf History. That was Ernest Banks. And that, guys and girls, brings us to the end of episode number 20. Thank you for listening. Please like, share, subscribe if you haven't already to my podcast to stay up to date with what's happening in golf courses throughout Australia and the golf greenkeeping and architecture history, the golf greenkeeping and architecture side of Australia. I'll try and keep you up to date. Plenty more to come. I've got a few interviews lined up, and we'll go back to normal programming with the next podcast, with Walking the Fairways. I'll give you a bit more up-to-date scenario of some of the work that's been going on around the country. Really looking forward to it. Hope to join you all again very, very soon. And in a couple of weeks, episode number 21 will fall in your lap. Thank you again, guys. Please share it around and let everyone know how good it is. You keep it green. You keep it green. You hit them clean and we'll keep them green. That's how it works, not the other way around. Have yourself a wonderful day.